The barracks were filled with the sound of boots scraping against the floor, each step echoing through the quiet room. But then, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Private Carter, why are you even here?" Sergeant Miller's eyes drilled into her. She had barely set foot into the line of recruits when the mockery started. "You couldn't carry a pack if your life depended on it." His words stung like a slap, and the rest of the squad was quick to join in. The other soldiers didn't even wait for the drill to end before they started whispering. "Bet she can't even run a mile," someone snickered from the back. "What's she even doing in here?" Someone else laughed. Jessica Carter, standing at attention with her hands clenched tight at her sides, couldn't speak. She wasn't sure if the fear in her chest was from the humiliation or from the sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. The weight of the moment settled like a heavy coat on her shoulders. She stood there, an outsider in a world she barely understood, her heart pounding in her chest. The pressure of their eyes on her was enough to make anyone break, but not Jessica. She held her chin up, despite the way her knees shook beneath her, despite the burning shame creeping up her neck. Sergeant Miller's harsh voice shattered the silence again. "Don't just stand there, Carter. Move it." The other recruits laughed. Jessica's boots scuffed the floor as she turned to face the line of cots, the weight of their eyes on her back. She could feel the bitterness in her throat, the way it burned to swallow. It wasn't fair. She wasn't the weakest one here. Hell, she wasn't the weakest one in her family. She just didn't fit. She didn't have the swagger of the others. No flashy gear, no polished boots, no military background. Just her. Her scrappy determination that had gotten her here in the first place. As she made her way to her bunk, she could hear the whispers picking up again. "Does she even belong here?" one of the soldiers murmured. The others chuckled. Jessica didn't respond. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She just took off her pack slowly, deliberately, and set it down by her cot. The room was too quiet now. She could feel it, the way the whole barracks had turned on her. It wasn't the first time this had happened. It wouldn't be the last. In the corner of the room, Corporal Johnson stood silently. He was older, more seasoned than most of the recruits, and despite his calm demeanor, Jessica could see something in his eyes, something that no one else seemed to notice. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze lingering just a little too long before he turned away. He didn't speak up. He didn't come to her defense. No one ever did. The world wasn't kind to soldiers like her. Quiet, unassuming, out of place. Later that day, as the sun began to set over the training field, Jessica stood at attention with the rest of the recruits. Drill Sergeant Miller was pacing in front of them, his voice booming across the field. "You think this is easy? You think you just walk into my camp and expect a free ride? Not a chance." The others seemed to snap to attention, the fear of the drill sergeant's wrath evident on their faces. But Jessica, standing a few paces back from the group, couldn't shake the feeling of being so far from home. It wasn't just the harsh training, the constant drill. It was the feeling of being invisible, of having no one care enough to even notice her struggle. The cadence started, and the others began to march in perfect unison. But Jessica faltered. Her feet didn't move as quickly as the others, and it was noticeable. She felt the eyes of her comrades bore into her back. "Pick it up, Carter," someone yelled from behind. "You're embarrassing yourself." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Her legs felt like lead as she struggled to keep pace. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. She hadn't expected it to be. But the isolation she felt in that moment, being the one who couldn't keep up, the one everyone was laughing at, hit harder than any drill Sergeant Miller could throw at her. Jessica pushed through the rest of the march, not once slowing her pace, though the voices continued to hiss at her from the sidelines. She was the last one across the finish line, but she made it. No one else noticed. No one cared. As she headed back to the barracks, exhausted and humiliated, her mind raced. It was only her first week, but it already felt like a lifetime. The struggle of fitting in, of proving she belonged, it was too much. The silent mockery, the ridicule from her fellow recruits. What kept her going? What was her reason for being here? Was it worth it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft, almost imperceptible sound behind her. She turned to find Corporal Johnson standing at the door, his arms crossed. He didn't say a word. His gaze just met hers, and for a brief moment, Jessica thought she saw something there, something more than just pity. He didn't speak. He didn't offer words of encouragement. But the silence, his quiet acknowledgement, was enough. Maybe it wasn't much. Maybe it didn't change anything. But it made her feel just a little bit less invisible. And that was something she needed right now. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. It was the third week in boot camp, and nothing had gotten easier. If anything, it was worse. The whispers were louder now, the mocking glances more frequent. Private Jessica Carter had become the target of almost every recruit. They laughed at her boots, her struggle to keep up, the way she couldn't seem to master the basics. But that was the least of her problems. The real issue was how it felt to be completely invisible, to show up every day, work harder than anyone else, and still feel like no one cared. It was a kind of loneliness that went deeper than any physical exhaustion. She wasn't just an outsider. She was the joke. It didn't help that Drill Sergeant Miller seemed to enjoy making her an example. "Carter!" he would bellow across the field during drills. "You're a liability. You're dead weight. Can't even hold your rifle right." His words echoed in her ears long after the drills ended. It was like he had a personal vendetta against her. Everyone else was doing their best to hide their smirks when she fumbled, when she stumbled, when she failed. And she was failing. Every damn day. The worst part was that she knew they were right. She wasn't built like the others. Her body wasn't as strong, her reflexes slower. She wasn't a natural soldier, like the other recruits who made everything look so easy. The fear that she didn't belong here sat heavy in her chest, gnawing at her with every drill, every failure. But it wasn't the drills that hurt most, it was the silence. No one ever reached out to her. No one ever tried to help, except for Corporal Johnson. Johnson was the one person who didn't laugh, didn't mock her. In fact, he barely said anything at all. But sometimes when the others were tearing her down, his eyes would meet hers for just a moment, and she'd catch a flicker of something. Sympathy maybe, or recognition of her struggle. He never spoke up, never intervened. But she noticed him watching her, observing her more than anyone else. And that was the smallest relief. At least one person saw her. Then came the day of the obstacle course. The course was designed to break you. Everyone knew it. Everyone feared it. The obstacle course at boot camp wasn't about physical fitness alone. It was about pushing your mind and spirit to the edge. And Jessica was terrified. She wasn't fast. She wasn't agile. She wasn't going to be the first to finish. She just wanted to make it through without completely embarrassing herself. As they lined up, Sergeant Miller barked orders. "No one gets through this unless you push yourself harder than ever before." The recruits shifted, all eyes on the course ahead. The sound of heavy boots thudded against the dirt, the air tense with anticipation. But Jessica felt her stomach drop. The course was impossible for someone like her. "Private Carter," Sergeant Miller called out, his voice cutting through the air. "I don't expect you to finish. I expect you to fail." It was a cruel thing to say, but Jessica had heard worse from him. What she hadn't expected was the tight knot of anger that rose in her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't let herself feel yet. The anger was powerful, but it didn't give her confidence. It fueled her fear. How could she prove him wrong when every part of her body was screaming that he was right? The course started with a sprint, a grueling uphill run followed by a series of obstacles, walls to climb, ropes to cross, mud pits, and tunnels. Jessica's legs felt like lead as she sprinted. The recruits were already ahead, their voices fading as they sped through. Her breathing became shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She stumbled over the first wall, struggling to pull herself up. The others were already onto the next obstacle, mocking her as they passed. "Come on, Carter! You're embarrassing yourself," someone yelled. "Didn't think you'd make it this far," another chimed in. Jessica ignored them. She gritted her teeth, pushing herself over the wall, but her arms burned. Her muscles were screaming for rest. She'd never felt so close to quitting, but then something inside her snapped. She couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the ridicule. Maybe it was the anger that had been simmering for weeks. But for the first time, Jessica didn't care. She wasn't doing this for Sergeant Miller. She wasn't even doing it for the others. She was doing it for herself. And that thought, that quiet spark of defiance, pushed her forward. She pulled herself up the ropes, scrambled through the mud pits, and crawled through the tunnels. Her hands were raw, her knees bruised, but she kept going. The more they mocked her, the faster she moved. It was a primal need to prove them wrong. By the time she reached the final wall, she could barely see straight. Her vision was blurred, her legs shaking, but she didn't stop. There was only one thought in her mind. Don't stop. Jessica reached the top of the final wall with a grunt of effort. She barely had time to register the accomplishment before the last recruit crossed the finish line. She wasn't first, but she wasn't last. She had done it, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't expected. Pride. But that wasn't the climax of the day. That came moments later. As the recruits gathered in front of Sergeant Miller, he was silent. His eyes scanned each of them, landing on Jessica last. Her heart pounded. She could feel his judgment heavy in the air. The others were laughing and patting each other on the back, but Jessica stood still, waiting. She didn't know what to expect, but she wasn't ready for the words that came next. You actually finished, Sergeant Miller said, his voice low and incredulous. You did it. And for the first time, there was no mockery in his tone, no insult, just the quiet recognition of what Jessica had done. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The other recruits stood in stunned silence. Jessica's chest swelled with pride. Corporal Johnson was standing at the back, his arms folded. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, his face unreadable, but his gaze never left her. That small, silent acknowledgement was enough. The rest of the recruits didn't know what to make of it. Some of them were still laughing, but their laughter was quieter now. Their mockery had lost its edge. Jessica had crossed a line that they couldn't ignore. Later, as she lay on her bunk, bruised and exhausted, she thought about what had just happened. She'd proven something to herself today, but it wasn't enough. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. But one thing was clear now. She wasn't giving up. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. The sun had barely risen, but the barracks were already buzzing with energy. Recruits were scrambling around, getting dressed, trying to beat the clock. Sergeant Miller's voice echoed, down the hall, sharp and commanding. Let's move it, ladies and gentlemen. No one's waiting for you. His tone made it clear that he wasn't about to tolerate any mistakes today. But Jessica wasn't worried about the time. She was worried about what was coming next. It had been a rough few weeks, but she was starting to find her footing. Every day felt like a test. Every drill, every mission was another chance to fail. But something inside her had shifted. The doubts, the insecurities that used to weigh her down were still there, but they no longer paralyzed her. Instead, they pushed her. When the others laughed, she kept moving. When Sergeant Miller tore into her, she kept breathing. But none of it was enough to make her feel like she belonged. She was still the outsider, still the one everyone underestimated. But now at least she was fighting back. The day started like any other. Early morning runs, weapons drills, and endless push-ups. The usual grind. But there was something different about today. The tension in the air was thicker than usual. The other recruits were quieter, their eyes flicking nervously toward the obstacle course looming ahead. Jessica knew why. They all knew. Today was the big test, the one that could make or break a soldier. The obstacle course wasn't just about physical strength, it was about mental toughness. How far could you push yourself before you broke? How much pain could you endure before you gave up? And Jessica knew she couldn't afford to give up. Not today. She lined up with the others, feeling the familiar pressure of eyes on her back. Sergeant Miller stood at the front, his eyes scanning the group like a hawk. He didn't even look at Jessica as he spoke, but his words were meant for her, even if he didn't say her name. You think you're ready for this? He barked, his voice laced with contempt. I'll be surprised if any of you make it through without quitting, and I'm not sure I'll be disappointed if you do. The recruit shifted uncomfortably, but Jessica kept her eyes forward. She didn't flinch. She'd heard worse from him. What was one more insult when they'd all been there for weeks, being ground down by the same cruel training? On your marks, Sergeant Miller's voice snapped, breaking her thoughts. Go! The course started like a blur, running, climbing, crawling. Jessica pushed herself harder than she ever had before. Her legs burned, her breath came in ragged gas, but she didn't stop. Not this time. The other recruits were already ahead, their confidence clear in every step. And then there was Jessica, struggling, fighting for every inch. Her arms screamed as she pulled herself up the ropes. Her fingers slipped. She fell. The others sped past her, their jeers loud in her ears. You're pathetic, Carter, someone yelled. Keep it up. You're almost a joke. The words stung, but they didn't stop her. She crawled through the mud, slipped through the tunnel, and forced herself up the final wall. The end was in sight, but just as she thought she was done, just as she thought she could finally catch her breath, she heard a shout. Carter, you're still behind. Move your ass. Sergeant Miller's voice rang out, sharp as ever. She looked ahead. The others had already finished, their faces gleaming with pride. And there she was, alone, covered in mud, barely holding it together. For a second, the weight of everything crashed down on her. All the mockery, all the doubt, the feeling of not being good enough. It was all right there. But then something shifted. It wasn't the other recruits that mattered. It wasn't Sergeant Miller. It was her. Jessica's hands tightened around the rope. She didn't care if she was last. She didn't care what anyone thought. She was going to finish this. She grabbed the rope again, pushed herself upward, and didn't stop. Every inch felt like a victory. When she finally pulled herself over that wall, when she finally crossed the finish line, she was gasping for air, her body screaming in pain. But something else was there too, a feeling she hadn't expected. Pride. Not because she'd been the fastest, not because she'd beaten anyone, but because she had finished. Sergeant Miller was waiting at the finish line, his eyes scanning her, cold and calculating. You finished, he said, as if the words themselves were a punishment. He didn't look impressed. He didn't even acknowledge her effort. He just turned on his heel and walked away. But Jessica didn't need his approval. She had done what no one thought she could. And that was enough. The other recruits were already talking, their voices low. Did she really just finish? One of them whispered. I thought she was done for sure. The whispers stung, but this time, Jessica didn't care. She had made it, and for the first time since she'd arrived at boot camp, she felt something she hadn't before. Respect. Later that evening, after dinner in the chow hall, the recruits were lounging around, chatting, some of them still in disbelief that Jessica had actually made it through the course. The usual jokes were still being thrown her way, but they were quieter now, more hesitant. And then, in the middle of the chatter, a voice broke through. Hey, Carter, a voice called from the other side of the room. It was Corporal Johnson. He wasn't one to speak up often, but there he was, his voice steady. You did good today. Don't let anyone tell you different. For a moment, Jessica just stared at him. No one had ever said anything like that to her here. Not from the recruits, certainly not from Sergeant Miller. Thanks, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I won't. Johnson didn't smile. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. There, in that small moment, was something Jessica hadn't realized she needed. A connection, a quiet, unspoken understanding. And as she sat down exhausted, surrounded by the others who were now just a little bit less sure of themselves, she couldn't help but smile. Not for them, not for the respect she might have earned, but for herself. It was the first time she truly felt like she belonged. The next day was another test, another mission. And this time, it wasn't just about physical strength. It was about what you did when everything went wrong. Jessica found herself paired with Thompson, the recruit who had mocked her the most. They were tasked with securing a fake compound, a standard mission that was supposed to test teamwork. But just a few minutes into the mission, disaster struck. Their equipment malfunctioned. The radio went dead. They were cut off from the rest of the squad. Thompson panicked. He froze. Carter, what the hell do we do now? He yelled, looking at her with wide eyes. Without thinking, Jessica took charge. She reached for the emergency gear, quickly assessing the situation. She knew exactly what to do. She had trained for this moment. Calm down, she said, her voice steady. We improvise. Follow my lead. Thompson didn't argue. He followed her commands as she secured their position, patched up their gear, and radioed for backup. It was one of the toughest situations she'd ever been in, but she kept her head, kept pushing forward. When the backup arrived, Jessica was the one who led them back to safety. Thompson didn't say much, but the look in his eyes told her everything. He knew what she was capable of now. He didn't mock her anymore. As they returned to the barracks, Sergeant Miller watched them from a distance, his face unreadable. But this time, there was no criticism, no insults, just silence. And Jessica knew that, in his way, he was respecting her now too. It wasn't the respect she'd always wanted, but it was enough. And for the first time, she realized something that changed everything. She didn't need anyone's approval. She was enough on her own. The battle was far from over, but Jessica had already won. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. It had been months since Jessica first stepped onto the training grounds, and though she'd made progress, the road had been anything but smooth. Every day was a fight, against the harsh drills, against her own self-doubt, and most of all, against the relentless mockery from her fellow recruits. But now something had changed. Jessica wasn't the same recruit who stumbled over her boots and struggled to keep up with the others. She was stronger, tougher, sharper. But the weight of being constantly underestimated was still there, still heavy on her shoulders. The morning after the last mission, Sergeant Miller called the recruits into the mess hall for an important briefing. The usual tension in the room was thicker now, and Jessica could sense it. It was more than just the mission. Something was brewing. Her nerves were tight, her stomach uneasy. "Listen up!" Sergeant Miller's voice boomed across the room, his eyes scanning the recruits. "We've got a real test coming up, and this time it's not going to be a drill. You're going to have to make real decisions. Real lives on the line. If you screw up, there's no second chance." Jessica swallowed hard. Real lives. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavier than anything she'd heard before. This wasn't just another test. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. This was real, and she had no idea if she was ready for what was coming. The briefing was over in minutes, but the anxiety lingered. She headed back to the barracks, her mind racing with what the mission could possibly entail. As she entered, she was met by the usual stares and whispers. This time, they weren't mocking her. They were sizing her up. It felt different now, but it didn't make the pressure any less intense. The next morning, they geared up, full kit, weapons, the works. No one said much, but the tension was palpable. Everyone knew this was a test, and they all wanted to prove themselves, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way Sergeant Miller had spoken, the cold edge in his voice, it was like he knew something they didn't. They boarded the trucks in silence, the weight of their packs and their nerves the only sounds.